Hello lovely people, my name is Emma. Welcome back to my channel and welcome if you are new. If there's one piece of news I love to read about, it's the discovery of an old ass document. Call me a nerd, but I love it. I love to hear what the people of centuries past were thinking and talking about. And in this case, what they were thinking was, that musty old rag did not contain the body of our Lord and Saviour Jesus Christmas. Thank you very much. That's right, I don't know why I'd be around the bush, because, I mean, you're going to have seen it from the video title already. I'm a master of suspense. That's right, we got even more recent discoveries, adding to the pile of evidence that says the Shroud of Turin is not legit. What's that, my lord? You would never be wrapped in that skanky old robe? Clearly, if he was wrapped in anything, Jesus would have been wrapped in a Jedi robe. Let's take it back a minute. If you already know the history of the Shroud of Turin and you know about all of the various studies that have occurred on it in the past, you can skip ahead using the chapter markers down below to the newest evidence. For the rest of you, hold on to your horses, it's all gonna get a bit Dan Brown. But even more boring. Oh!
How can I expect a fair and honest discussion from such a literary snob? I'm unsubscribing right now!
With the greatest of respect to those of you who enjoy Dan Brown novels, I assume it is at least partly on some ironic level. As per the absolutely horrifically awful Shroud of Turin website, the Shroud of Turin is the singly most studied artifact in human history. You'd think that the importance that this alleged artifact has to so many millions of people, you'd think that they could have paid someone to make a better website. And maybe it was a really good website and they just haven't updated it in 15 years. We believe that if you have access to the facts, you can make up your own mind about the Shroud. I don't know if I totally hold with that, because people have made up their own mind about all sorts of facts and they believe that we never landed on the moon and that the Earth is flat. Maybe we should trust experts. Oh, that is fun. You can mouse over and have a look at the pre- and post-restoration Shroud. So let's take it all the way back, baby. The first mention we have of the Shroud in history is 1354, when it is recorded that it wound up in the hands of a famed knight, Geoffrey de Charnay. In 1389 it went on exhibition, and the local Bishop of Troyes declared it cunningly painted, the truth being attested by the artist who painted it. So this bishop denounced the Shroud in a letter to the Pope at the time. Obviously the Pope at the time, not the Pope of the future. What a stupid thing to say. He denounced the Shroud in a letter to the Pope where he claimed that the artist who made it had confessed to forging this Shroud. The Pope allowed it to continue being exhibited as a symbol or an icon, a representation of this important moment in their faith. So our earliest extant records of the Shroud of Turin are of it popping into existence and then a well-respected bishop telling the Pope that it was definitely a forgery. For some reason, in years hence, in centuries hence, popes started taking it for granted that this was an authentic artifact that was indeed wrapped around the body of Christ. Bearing in mind this is 1400 years after the fact. In 1453, Geoffrey de Charnay's granddaughter Marguerite gave the Shroud to the House of Savoy at Chambéry, where it was damaged by fire and water in 1532, hence the damage that you can see to it now. The damage didn't help in assessing its authenticity. Fast forward all the way to the late 1970s, early 80s, and enter STURP. That is the Shroud of Turin Research Project. STURP. Very serious business. It's a cool thing. A bunch of scientists, under no direction from any particular authority, wanted to study it, thought it was valuable to study, started taking a look, invited more people to take a look. The idea to scientifically date the Shroud came around in the 60s, actually, but at the time it would have required the destruction of too much of the fabric, and so that was refused. In the 1970s, though, scientists developed new techniques for radiocarbon dating, prompting the Roman Catholic Church to create STURP. I know it sounds stupid because I'm saying it like that, but I can't not. STURP. I can't not say it like Homer Simpson would say it, okay? That's just how I am as a person. You have to accept that. If you can't handle me at my STURP, you don't get me at my everything else. The Shroud of Turin research project involved over 30 scientists, multi-faith, non-Christians included. I'm going to pronounce everybody's names in this wrong, but it'll take 1,000 years if I look up exactly how each of them is pronounced. So you'll just have to bear with me, and I'm sorry. A commission headed by chemist Robert H. Deininger and physicist Harry E. Gove consulted numerous laboratories which were able to carbon date small fabric samples. The 6 labs that showed interest in performing the procedure fell into 2 categories according to method. 2 used a proportional counter approach. The proportional counter according to the internet, is a type of gaseous ionizing detector which is used to measure particles of ionizing radiation. The other labs used accelerator mass spectrometry. Spectrometry? Yeah, that is right. It just is hard to say. Please be nice to me, I'm only small. Accelerator mass spectrometry is a form of mass spectrometry that accelerates ions to extraordinarily high kinetic energies before mass analysis. The point being that the scientists decided, in the interest of obtaining replicable and independent results, that different labs would conduct their tests at the same time. However, there was a disagreement between the STIRP... Come on. There was a disagreement between the STIRP group and the laboratories, because these are independent laboratory candidates, which turned into a public relations nightmare. STIRP expected to perform the radiometric examination under its own aegis after the other examinations had been completed, while the laboratories considered radiocarbon dating to be the prime test. Years are passing while this disagreement is happening. 1986. A meeting with ecclesiastical authorities took place on September 29th, 1986, to determine the way forward. By way of a compromise, they created the Turin Protocol. This stated that carbon dating would be the only test performed. Original and control samples indistinguishable from each other would be provided, aka performing a blind test. The test would be performed concurrently by 7 laboratories under the joint supervision of the Pontifical Academy of Science, the Archbishop of Turin, and the British Museum. Both dating methods would be adopted. The sample offered to each laboratory would weigh 28 milligrams, in total equivalent to 9 centimeters squared of cloth. The laboratories would not communicate with each other during the testing, nor divulge the results of the test to anyone but the 3 supervising authorities. But then... I'm sure you will agree, a very sensible compromise on many fronts, with a focus on scientific integrity. Forget all that, says the Vatican. The procedure would probably be performed by 2 or 3 laboratories at most. On October 10th, Cardinal Anastasio Balastro officially announced to the 7 laboratories that the proportional counter method would not be used, because this method would require too much shroud material. Only 3 laboratories, Oxford, Tuscan and Zurich, would be provided with shroud samples to be tested. The sole supervising institution would be the British Museum. Obviously, these deviations from the Turin Agreement, which now feels redundant, were heavily criticised. The blind test method was abandoned because the distinctive 3-to-1 herringbone twill weave of the shroud could not be matched in the controls, so it was always possible for a laboratory to identify the actual shroud. April 17th, 1988, 10 years after the STIRP project had been initialised, British Museum Scientific Director Michael Tite published in Nature the final protocol. The laboratories at Oxford, Zurich and Tuscan would perform the test. The laboratories would each receive 2 control samples clearly distinguishable from the shroud sample. So yes, control samples, no blind testing. Each test would be filmed. There would be no comparison of results nor communication between laboratories until the results be certified as definitive, and the proportional counter method would not be used because it required gram quantities rather than milligram quantities of shroud material, as discussed earlier. So the testing was finally performed at these 3 laboratories. October 13th, 1988, at a very well-attended press conference, the results were announced. The result of all that nonsense is that the radiocarbon dating tested the shroud to a date of 1260 to 1390 with 95% confidence. Now, obviously we've been over a lot of criticism of the protocols involved anyway, the lack of blind testing, etc., but we do have 3 separate labs obtaining mutually compatible results. The main reason that people argue with this, the main reason that people don't that lots of people have criticisms of this particular testing, the testing of one specific area of the shroud, the hypothesis being that what was dated was a medieval repair to the shroud rather than the original shroud. This theory is typically known as invisible reweaving, which is actually a pretty problematic idea in itself. The hypothesis goes that this was a medieval repair job that we were unable to detect. There's all sorts of analyses of like small fibres that could be cotton fibres and things like that. However, we have lots of experts refuting this. Mechthild Fleury-Lemberg, so probably getting that so wrong, an expert in the restoration of textiles who headed the restoration and conservation of the Turin Shroud in 2002, rejected the theory of invisible reweaving, pointing out that it would be technically impossible to perform such a repair without leaving traces, and that she found no such traces in her study of the shroud. Perhaps even more importantly, Harry E. Gove, who you might remember from earlier, and who you might know of from helping to invent carbon dating in the first place, radiocarbon dating, He was closely involved in setting up the stirp. He has written that another argument has been made that part of the shroud was subjected to medieval textile restoration. He says, if so, the restoration would have had to been done with such incredible virtuosity as to render it microscopically indistinguishable from the real thing. Even modern so-called invisible weaving can readily be detected under a microscope, so this possibility seems unlikely. It seems very convincing that what was measured in the laboratories was genuine cloth from the shroud after it had been subjected to rigorous cleaning procedures. Probably no sample for carbon dating has ever been subjected to such scrupulously careful examination and treatment, nor perhaps ever will again. In December 2010, Timothy Jull, a member of the 1988 radiocarbon dating team, and editor of the peer-reviewed journal Radiocarbon, co-authored an article in that journal with Rachel A. Freer-Waters. They examined a portion of the radiocarbon sample that was left over from the section used by the University of Arizona in 1988 for the carbon dating exercise. They viewed the fragment using a low magnification stereo microscope, as well as under high magnification through both transmitted light and polarized light, and then with epifluorescence microscopy? I don't know what that is. They viewed the fragment using multiple methods, I think is the important thing we take away from that. They found only low levels of contamination by a few cotton fibres, and no evidence that the samples actually used for measurements in the C14 dating process were dyed, treated, or otherwise manipulated. They concluded that the radiocarbon dating had been performed on a sample of the original shroud material. Not totally conclusive in the sense that without a time machine, none of these historical studies are totally conclusive. The arguments, while very reasonable arguments about the lack of blind testing and things like that, even though it seems like blind testing was rejected because it just wasn't really possible. Plenty of reasonable arguments about the kind of, about some of the methods used in the radiocarbon dating process. However, the arguments that we're seeing against the results, which are pretty conclusive, pointing this to be like a 13th century, 14th century medieval shroud. The arguments against it are the same sort of arguments that young Earth creationists use against the radiocarbon dating of fossils and things like that. Debunked by actual experts. They don't really hold water. These arguments only survive because, again, without a time machine, there is no possible concrete way to say yes or no, this is a completely accurate test. A lot of particularly religious, fundamentalist kind of anti-science propaganda relies on this notion of it's only a theory. Those people love the unfalsifiable, right? You can't say definitively 100% that yes, this is true, so for the sake of my beliefs, I'm going to say that it's false. Whereas, as this has been pointed out, this is probably the most studied artifact in, like, all of modern history. Does that make sense? I'm going to say it anyway, in modern history, and was subjected to such incredibly rigorous testing, was properly cleaned. You know, the best results we could probably ever get suggest that this is from the 1300s. However, there was another breaking study in 2022. According to reports on the subject, a group of Italian scientists performed wide-angle X-ray scattering on the Shroud of Turin. That's supposed to measure the degradation of cellulose fibres in order to date something. Importantly, this isn't a widely accepted or widely used method of dating. In fact, as far as I can tell, it seems to be only used and invented by the authors of this study, who are not neutral scientists, but in fact approaching it from the perspective of believers. Doesn't mean they can't be right, does mean that we have to factor in their bias. Part of what makes this method so unreliable is because it's measuring the aging of the canvas, of the tissue, which can be massively affected by environmental factors. I guess I'm not an expert, so I don't know how much of a difference this makes, but the shroud has been on fire, like a couple of times. So I do wonder as a layman if that would affect you know, the ability of this method to properly age the shroud. Anyway, it became a big thing because they managed to date it to the 1st, 2nd century. The method itself, widely criticised, not accepted by the wider scientific community. It was done and had the results that people wanted, so it became mainstream news. In 1980, a scientist called Dr. McCrone used electron microscopy and X-ray diffraction and found red ochre and vermilion, and the electron microprobe analyzer found iron, mercury, and sulfur on a dozen of the blood image area samples, which suggests, and what Dr. McCrone believes, is that the image was painted twice, once with red ochre and once with vermilion to enhance the blood image areas. His hypothesis being that the cloth, the Shroud of Turin, was a medieval painting produced shortly before its first recorded appearance in history in 1356. Which is the theory that makes the most sense to me and seems to follow the evidence. So, to summarise all of that, all of the accepted, peer-reviewed, mainstream, multidisciplinary scientific study suggests that the Shroud of Turin originated between the 13th and the 15th century, which is also when it started appearing in historical documents. In my opinion, it's very suspicious that there would have been no mention of this relic until 1300 years after the fact, and the earliest mentions of this relic being respected bishops arguing that this was a forgery, and in fact arguing that they knew who had painted it. The person who had painted it had admitted to it being an artwork, a recent creation. What reason does an honest, God-fearing bishop of the 14th century have for lying to the Pope about this being a forgery? Seems unlikely. Fast forward to 2025. Hey, welcome back. You're looking great. You don't look a day over 600 years old. Some fairly interesting news from this year. A 3D designer and digital graphics expert, Cicero Moraes, used 3D modelling software to model how clothing would move on two types of forms, a full three-dimensional human body and a low-relief sculpture, aka a flat surface with shallow raised areas. In Moraes' recent digital test, the image that was produced when a cloth was virtually draped over a 3D human model appeared warped, wider and misshapen, due to the nature of fabric flowing over volume. That distortion is called the Agamemnon mask effect. On the other hand, the imprint from a low-relief sculpture closely matched the shape and dimensions of that on the Turin shroud. The contact pattern generated by the low-relief model is more compatible with the shroud's image, Moraes wrote in that study. It shows less anatomical distortion and greater fidelity to the observed contours. He described how a shallow sculpture, maybe made of wood, stone, or metal, would be a strong candidate to serve as a mould. Heat or pigment may have been applied only to the embossed areas of the surface to create an imprint on the fabric. This way, Moraes contended, this method would explain the smooth, flat image one finds on the shroud, unlike the distorted result one might find by wrapping fabric around a real human body. Because it does appear like a face, right? It doesn't have the smudging sort of effect that if you actually wrapped something around your face, you would have this distorted area, right? During the medieval period, low-relief depictions of religious individuals, particularly on tombstones, were common in Europe. Shallow carvings would have been a familiar practice to artists during the time. So you can see that up here in this image. This is from Moraes' study, and he didn't attempt to accurately recreate what would have been the medieval tools of artistry at the time. He wasn't attempting to date it or age it. This was just a study in which he showed that this is this method of creating the image seems more compatible with the shroud that we have, the artifact that we have, as a piece of religious artwork. This is the touch texture in the three-dimensional model on the shroud. B here is the actual texture of the shroud. You can see A representing the way that a three-dimensional human body would be wrapped, or the way the relief would appear after a three-dimensional human body had been wrapped in cloth, has all this distortion. Kind of looks like it's got a Green Man thing going on the head there, right? Pagan. But so you have this distortion. It's not like the sort of perfect flat representation of a human body that the shroud is, which you can see in C, if it was a flat, shallow sort of relief. So that's not a scientific analysis. That's a 3D artist offering some quite compelling, I think, insights into how the shroud might have been created and the problems with assuming that this image was formed by a cloth wrapping a human being. And finally, most recently, hot off the press, this news. So this is a recently discovered treatise on unexplained phenomena, dated between 1355 and 1382. The Norman scholar Nicole Resme refers to the shroud as a patent example of clerical fraud, prompting him to be more broadly suspicious of the word of ecclesiastics. Resme writes, "I do not need to believe anyone who claims someone performed such miracle for me, because many clergymen thus deceive others in order to elicit offerings for their churches." The problems of the 14th century are still the problems of today. This is clearly the case for a church in Champagne, where it was said that there was the shroud of the Lord Jesus Christ, and for the almost infinite number of those who have forged such things and others. Oresme later became the Bishop of Lisieux in France, and was a super important religious figure in the Middle Ages, well regarded for his rational explanations for so-called miracles. Guys, when we talk about the important historical, naturalist, scientific work that has been performed by good, scrupulous Christians through the ages, this is the kind of person we're talking about. Not this Vatican approach of, sure, there have been 10 billion miracles and all of these so-called artifacts are banned from scientific study. No, real, honest to God, if you'll forgive the slightly too appropriate phrasing, proper rational contextualizing, fakes and frauds. You love to see it. Dr. Nicolas Sarzoud, probably not saying that right, a historian at the Université Catholique of Louvain, Belgium, and lead author of this new study, says, "What makes Oresme's writings stand out is his attempt to provide rational explanations for unexplained phenomena, rather than interpreting them as divine or demonic." Which is crazy that stands out as unique. So that is another well-respected bishop from medieval times asserting with complete confidence the Shroud of Turin is absolutely a clerical forgery, clerical fraud, as many throughout history have done since this artifact popped into being again 1300 years after supposedly it should have come into being. All of that corroborating and being corroborated by the scientific studies performed on the shroud, which also point to it being a production of the 13th to 15th century. There you go, yet more evidence that the Shroud of Turin was not in fact a shroud that wrapped Jesus Christ in history, but as it was presented in our earliest documents, simply a piece of medieval artistry. Do let me know your thoughts down below if you happen to have any expertise in any of the dating methods or 3D modelling or anything of this particular nature that you can give some more insight into. Please drop it for us down below. You know we love to learn. What a bunch of nerds. But yeah, seriously, please and thank you.
Do give the video a like and
Subscribe to the channel and check out my playlists for all sorts of videos on this and other completely unrelated topics. Whatever you want, whatever you need, I got a video for it. That's an Emma Thorne guarantee. The best way to support me and this channel is via the Patreon, especially helpful right now because I am about to move house. That's why the walls look so depressing. That bag there, that's full of the stuff that used to be on the walls. I'm probably going to miss a couple of uploads. I'm going to be without my computer for a little bit while I'm moving house and getting rid of this desk and getting a new desk and all of the nonsense around that, so your support during this trying time is very appreciated, and with that I must give a big old thank you and a shout out to my giant chickens and colossal quackers over on Patreon, especially Conla. God damn it, Conla. Most importantly, have yourselves a very lovely week, and I will see you really soon.